There is something like that empty space right there means there's no racial bias. None at all. Like, that's crazy. I have a feeling that as you're watching this, there are going to be some controversial thoughts that come to your mind, so please keep the comments discussion civil throughout this video. Hi, I'm Craig and welcome to Market Power. Taking a look at this graph right here, it tells an interesting story. Some economists were interested in measuring racial bias among NBA referees, and this shows their results. It looks at racial bias across 3 time periods, and what you'll notice is right here at the beginning, there's a strong racial bias among referees. In the middle, that bias stays the same, but in the end, this has totally disappeared. Now, this beginning part received a lot of attention, and I mean a lot of attention. This ending part right here has received essentially 0 attention. And that's something I want to talk about today. Do white NBA referees call more fouls on black players? I think a first question that we need to address is, why are economists looking at the NBA at all? Like, economists are supposed to deal with boring stuff like the stock market or GDP or just really things that involve prices and quantities and graph shifting around. Where does the NBA come into this? Racial discrimination is clearly an economic issue, and it is a really interesting one at that. Economists look at discrimination as this trade-off between interacting with another group and the price that you have to pay. NBA referees can help us understand how racial bias goes on inside our mind. And to understand what I'm talking about here, let me bring up Daniel Kahneman, author of Thinking Fast and Slow. He describes what goes on in our mind as 2 systems. System 1 is quick, rash, impulsive, judgmental. It goes really, really fast. System 2 is more calculating and rational and thinks through the decisions it's making. When economists talk about discrimination, they're usually thinking in a system 2 mindset. People have preferences between different groups and they make some sort of discrimination between them. And when they're making that discrimination, they're carefully considering the trade-off of interacting with that group versus receiving a cheaper product. NBA referees, on the other hand, are in a really quick-paced environment and need to make decisions very, very fast. That means that they're relying primarily on system 1 to make their decisions. The few times that referees get to use their system 2 is when they go and look at instant replay and they have the time to rationalize and calculate and think, like, is that a foul or was that the call that we should have made? And they have that time to think through it. But most of the time they're not in that stage. They see something, they make a call. The delay between when the foul happens and when the whistle is blown is almost instantaneous, right? There is a very short time for that decision to be made. So if NBA referees are spending their time in system 1, what can we learn about racial bias from these people who are interacting with players of different races in this one type of mindset? Which brings us back to the first part of this graph, which shows large racial bias in foul calls. What do I mean by racial bias in foul calls? Well, back in about 2006, 2007, 2 economists named Joe Price and Justin Wolfers started looking at what happens to foul calls based on the racial composition of the referee crew. Referee crews are assigned to games and there's 3 referees per game. That means the racial composition of the referees can vary quite a lot. Sometimes you can have 3 white referees, sometimes 3 black referees, or something in between. This raises an interesting question. What do fouls for black players look like when there are 3 white referees versus 3 black referees? And similarly, what happens to fouls for white players when there are 3 white referees and 3 black referees? The NBA assigns referee crews essentially randomly, right? There are some things that go into their consideration, like you can't ref the same team more than a certain amount of times per season, but overall, like, they're not taking into account what the player races are or even the composition of the referee crew when they make those assignments. That means if there is no racial bias amongst referees, then there should be no correlation between your foul rate and the racial composition of the referee crew. Like, they don't matter to what happens with fouls, they just call fouls the same for everybody, and therefore when there are 3 black referees, your foul calls should look the same as if there were 3 white referees. That is not what Joe Price and Justin Wolfers found. They collected data on nearly every player and game from 1991 all the way through 2004. And comparing these statistics, doing lots of econometrics that I'm not going to go into because I don't want to torture you in this nice video. They found that the more white referees there are, the fewer fouls that are called on white players. And the more black referees there are, the fewer fouls that are called on black players. When this research went public in 2007, it was a major deal. It hit the front page of the New York Times. David Stern, the NBA commissioner, was commenting on it. He commissioned his own study. Players were being interviewed about this. This was a big deal and sort of rocked the industry. Like I said at the beginning of this video, the first part of this graph received a lot of attention. That first bar is the study done by Price and Wolfers. But the other two parts have not received the just attention they deserve. The economists want to know if their study had made any difference at all. And so they grabbed data from 2005 to 2010. Now remember, their original study ended in 2004, and then the study went public in 2007. So this actually splits up the data really nicely. What you have is a few years from 2005, 2006, and most of the 2007 season were contained in the pre-study release, right? Nobody knew about this racial bias, and so that was before what's happened. So this gives us an opportunity to say, was there still racial bias from that earlier study present before the study was made public, right? So this gives us a way to confirm that the study was actually legitimate. And then it also has some years after the study is made public, which gives us that opportunity to say, did anything change? So the second bar is the results from after their study ends in 2004 up until 2007 when their study was made public. And what we see is there is like no difference between the two, right? There's just as much racial bias in their study as there is in this other world. This is good news. This is telling us that this is something actually happening. It wasn't some sort of publication bias. It wasn't some sort of like random thing. But then like there is something like that empty space right there means there's no racial bias. None at all. Like that's crazy. Now's the time to give you full disclosure. I worked on this project at the very beginning when we were trying to figure out if any difference had been made by the study. So I actually ran some of the first tests on here. Some of the graphs are still in this paper. So full disclosure, I did participate in this study. And I remember the result when we first found this. At first, we thought there is no way this is true. Like we had to have made a mistake. But then the more we probed into it, we realized there was no way this was not true. Like racial bias had actually gone away after the study was made public. What happened? Joe Price, Justin Wolfers, and another economist, Devin Pope, continued to probe into this question and ask, why did racial bias go away after this study was made public? And they concluded that awareness of racial bias helps you overcome it. Because the study was such a big deal when it went public, there is no way the referees did not know about it. So now all of a sudden the referees are being confronted with their own racial bias, and they have this opportunity to engage their system 2 to train their system 1. Can I reduce the bias that I am perpetuating in these NBA games? And they did. And what's really amazing is they cracked down on their racial bias without getting rid of any of their other sorts of biases. So there are biases that were found by Joe Price and some other co-authors that show that referees typically favor the home team, or in close games they change the way they make their calls. None of those biases went away after this study was published. It was only the racial bias. Like this gives more evidence that they were actually influenced by economic research, which has to be amazing. Like, who in the world is influenced by economic research? No one. No one cares about what us economists are saying most of the time, right? So, hey, like economists made some sort of impact on this world. Like, we should be talking about this more. And yet we're not. Like, why aren't we talking about the fact that this economic study made a huge difference, not just on the NBA, but can make a difference in our lives, that we can understand how we deal with sorts of discrimination by just becoming aware of them and engaging our system 2 to train our system 1. The data unequivocally say that there was racial bias beforehand and that racial bias went away. What do you think? What's going on? Do you think this is all just no one can trust data? That's the wrong answer, by the way, but like, do you feel like you've seen any sort of change? Do you think awareness can actually reduce your biases? Let me know in the comments below. Let's talk about how we can improve the world by understanding economic research. Thanks for watching today. Make sure you subscribe so that way I can continue telling people about really important economic research that a lot of people aren't paying attention to.